To Kill a Mockingbird, Reader's Digest version, Chapter 1, Part 2. Dill left us in September to return to Meridian. I was miserable without him until it occurred to me that I would be starting to school in a week. I never looked forward more to anything in my life. Jim condescended to take me to school the first day. At the edge of the schoolyard, he explained that during school hours I was not to bother him. "You mean we can't play anymore?" I asked. "At home, we'll do like we always do," he said. "But you'll see, school's different." It certainly was. Miss Caroline Fisher, our teacher, was no more than 21. She had bright auburn hair, pink cheeks, and wore high-heeled pumps and a red and white striped dress. She looked and smelled like a peppermint drop. The first morning, Miss Caroline printed her name on the blackboard and said, "This says, I am Miss Caroline Fisher. I am from North Alabama, from Winston County." The class murmured apprehensively. When Alabama seceded from the Union in 1861, Winston County seceded from Alabama, and every child in Macomb County knew it. North Alabama was full of liquor interests, steel companies, Republicans, professors, and other persons of no background. Miss Caroline began the day by printing the alphabet in enormous capitals on the blackboard. She asked, "Does anybody know what these are?" Everybody did. Most of the first grade had failed it last year. She chose me, and as I read the alphabet, a faint line appeared between her eyebrows. After making me read most of my first reader, she discovered that I was literate and looked at me with distaste. Miss Caroline told me to tell my father not to teach me any more. "It's best," she said, "to begin reading with a fresh mind. I'll take over from here and try to undo the damage." I retired, meditating upon my crime. I never deliberately learned to read, but for all the evenings in my memory, I had been wallowing illicitly in the daily papers or anything else Atticus happened to be reading when I crawled into his lap every night. I stared out the window until recess, when Jim asked me how I was getting along. "Jim, that lady says Atticus has been teaching me to read and for him to stop it." "Don't worry, Scout," Jim comforted me. "Our teacher says Miss Caroline's introducing a new way of teaching. You don't learn much out of books. If you want to learn about cows, for instance, you go milk one, see? It's the new way they're teaching the first grade. It's called the Dewey Decimal System." Soon, Miss Caroline was waving cards at us on which were printed "the," "cat," "man," and "you." I was bored, so I began a letter to Dill. Miss Caroline caught me writing and told me to tell my father to stop teaching me. "Dear," she said, "we don't write in the first grade, we print. You won't learn to write until you're in the third grade." Calpurnia was to blame for this. It kept me from driving her crazy on rainy days, I guess. She would set me at a writing task by scrawling out the alphabet firmly across the top of a tablet, then copying out a chapter of the Bible beneath. If I reproduced her penmanship satisfactorily, she would reward me with an open-faced sandwich of bread, butter, and sugar. "Everybody who brings his lunch, put it on top of his desk," said Miss Caroline, breaking into my new grudge against Calpurnia. Molasses buckets appeared from nowhere, and Miss Caroline walked up and down, peering into lunch containers, nodding if the contents pleased her. She stopped at Walter Cunningham's desk. "Where's yours?" she asked. Walter Cunningham's face told everybody in the first grade he had hookworms, and his absence of shoes told us how he got them. Well, Walter did have on a clean shirt and neatly mended overalls. "Did you forget your lunch today?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter looked straight ahead. I saw a muscle jump in his skinny jaw. "Yes'm," he finally mumbled. Miss Caroline went to her desk and opened her purse. "Here's a quarter," she said. "Eat downtown. You can pay me back tomorrow." "No, thank you, ma'am," Walter drawled softly. Impatience crept into Miss Caroline's voice. "Here, Walter," someone whispered. "Tell her, Scout." I rose. Miss Caroline?" "He's a Cunningham." I sat back down. "What, Jean Louise?" I thought I had made things sufficiently clear. Walter didn't forget his lunch. He didn't have any, nor would he have any tomorrow, and he had probably never seen 3 quarters together in his life. I tried again. Miss Caroline, you'll get to know all the county folks after a while. Walter's one of the Cunninghams. They never take anything they can't pay back. No church baskets, no script stamps. I knew about the Cunningham tribe because Walter's father was one of Atticus's clients. After a conversation in our living room one night about his entailment, Mr. Cunningham had said, "Mr. Finch, I don't know when I'll ever be able to pay you." "Let that be the least of your worries, Walter," Atticus said. I asked Jim later what entailment was, and he described it as a condition of having your tail in a crack. So I asked Atticus if Mr. Cunningham would ever pay us. "Not in money," Atticus said, "but I'll be paid. You watch." We watched. One morning, Jim and I found a load of stove wood in the backyard. Later, a sack of hickory nuts appeared on the back steps. With Christmas came a crate of smilax and holly. "Why does he pay you like that?" I asked. "Because that's the only way he can pay me. The Cunninghams are farmers, and the crash hit them hardest. Mr. Cunningham," Atticus explained, "could get a WPA job if he held his mouth right, but he was willing to go hungry to keep his land and vote as he pleased." It was beyond my ability to explain these things as well as Atticus, so I said, "You're shaming Walter, Miss Caroline. He hasn't got a quarter to bring you, and you can't use any stove wood." Miss Caroline stood stock still, then grabbed me by the collar and hauled me to her desk. "Jean Louise, I've had about enough, my dear. Hold out your hand." I thought she was going to spit in it. In Macomb, this was a time-honored method of sealing oral contracts. But instead, she picked up a ruler and gave me half a dozen quick little pats, then told me to stand in the corner. A storm of laughter broke loose when it finally occurred to the class that Miss Caroline had whipped me. My sojourn in the corner was a short one. Saved by the bell, Miss Caroline watched the class file out for lunch. As I was the last to leave, I saw her sink into her chair and bury her head in her arms. Had her conduct been more friendly to me, I would have felt sorry for her. She was a pretty little thing. Catching Walter in the schoolyard gave me some pleasure, but when I was rubbing his nose in the dirt, Jim came by and told me to stop. "You're bigger than he is," he said. "He made me start off on the wrong foot," I said, and explained. Walter had picked himself up and was standing, listening. He looked as if he had been raised on fish food. His blue eyes were red-rimmed and watery. Jim said, "Your daddy, Mr. Walter Cunningham from Old Sarum?" And Walter nodded. Jim grinned. "Come on home to dinner with us, Walter. We'd be glad to have you." Walter's face brightened, then darkened. Jim said, "Our daddy's a friend of your daddy's." Walter stood where he was, biting his lip. Jim gave up, and we were nearly to the Radley place when Walter called. "Hey, I'm coming." He caught up with us, and when we reached our front steps, Jim ran to the kitchen and told Calpurnia we had company. Atticus greeted Walter and began a discussion about crops neither Jim nor I could follow. "The reason I can't pass the first grade, Mr. Finch, is I've had to stay out every spring and help Papa chop cotton. But there's another one at the house now that's field size." While Walter piled food on his plate, he and Atticus talked together like men. Atticus was expounding upon farm problems when Walter asked if there was any molasses in the house. Calpurnia brought the syrup pitcher, and Walter poured syrup on his vegetables and meat with a generous hand. I asked what the Sam Hill he was doing. The silver saucer clattered as Walter replaced the pitcher. He ducked his head. Atticus shook his head at me. "But he's drowned his dinner in syrup," I protested. "He's poured it all over." Then Calpurnia requested my presence in the kitchen. She was furious, and when she was furious, Calpurnia's grammar became erratic. "There's some folks who don't eat like us," she whispered fiercely, "but you ain't called on to contradict them at the table when they don't. That boy's your company, and if he wants to eat up the tablecloth, you let him. You hear?" "He ain't company, Cal. He's just a Cunningham. Anybody sets foot in this house, your company. You folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but you're disgracing them. If you can't act fit to eat at the table, you can just sit in here and eat in the kitchen. Calpurnia sent me through the swinging door to the dining room with a stinging smack. Jim and Walter returned to school ahead of me. I stayed behind to advise Atticus of Calpurnia's iniquities. She likes Jim better than she likes me anyway, I concluded, and suggested that Atticus lose no time in packing her off. Have you ever considered that Jim doesn't worry her half as much? Atticus's voice was flinty. You think about how much Cal does for you, and you mind her, you hear? I returned to school and sat at my desk, hating Calpurnia steadily, until a sudden shriek shattered my resentment. It's alive! Miss Caroline screamed. She pointed a shaking finger at a hulking individual unknown to me. It crawled out of his hair. The cootie's host searched the scalp above his forehead, located his guest, and pinched it between his thumb and forefinger, while Miss Caroline watched in horrid fascination. Finally, she found her voice. What is your name, son? She asked softly. The boy blinked. Burris Ewell. He was the filthiest human being I had ever seen. We'll excuse you for this afternoon, said Miss Caroline. Please bathe yourself before you come back tomorrow. The boy rose and stood there laughing rudely. I was just leaving anyway, missus. I'd done my time for this year. One of the experienced members of the class said, Ewells always leave first day every year. The truant lady give up on 'em. She reckons she carried out the law just getting 'em here. Rest of the year you mark 'em absent. But what about their parents? Asked Miss Caroline in genuine concern. Ain't got no mother, and their pa's right contentious. Miss Caroline said, Sit back down, please, Burris. And the moment she said it, I knew she had made a serious mistake. The boy flashed anger. Try and make me, missus. Little Chuck Little got to his feet. Let him go, ma'am, he said. He's a mean one, a hard-down mean one. Miss Caroline gave up. Burris, go home. I'll have to report this. Burris snorted and slouched leisurely to the door. Then, safely out of range, he turned and shouted, You ain't making me go nowhere, missus. You just remember that. You ain't making me go nowhere. He waited until he was sure she was crying. Then he shuffled out of the room. Soon we were clustered around her desk, trying to comfort her. You ain't called on to teach folks like that. Them ain't Maycomb's ways, Miss Caroline, not really. That evening, Atticus was full of questions about school, but my replies were monosyllabic, and he did not press me. Perhaps Calpurnia sensed that my day had been a grim one. She let me watch her fix supper. I missed you today, she said. The house got so lonesome long about 2 o'clock I had to turn on the radio. She bent down and kissed me, and I wondered what had come over her. After supper, Atticus sat down with the paper and called, Scout, ready to read? The Lord had sent me more than I could bear, and I went to the front porch. Atticus followed me and sat down on the swing. Something wrong, Scout? I told Atticus I didn't feel very well and didn't think I'd go to school anymore if it was all right with him. Atticus crossed his legs and waited in amiable silence while I sought to reinforce my position. You never went to school and you do all right. You can teach me like Granddaddy taught you and Uncle Jack. No, I can't, said Atticus. I have to make our living. Besides, they'd put me in jail if I kept you at home. Dose of magnesia for you tonight and school tomorrow. I'm feeling all right, really. Thought so. Now, what's the matter? Bit by bit, I told him the day's misfortune. And she said you taught me all wrong, so we can't ever read anymore, ever. Please don't send me back, please, sir. Atticus stood up, walked to the end of the porch, and examined the wisteria vine. Then he strolled back to me. Scout, he said, if you can learn a simple trick, you'll get along better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. Sir? Until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Atticus said I had learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned several things herself. If I'd put myself in her shoes, I'd see that I could not expect her to learn all Maycomb's ways in one day, and I would not hold her responsible when she knew no better. I said, I didn't know no better than to read to her, and she held me responsible. Atticus, I don't have to go to school. Burris Ewell just goes the first day. Atticus said the Ewells had been the disgrace of Maycomb for 3 generations. They were people, but they lived like animals. There are ways of keeping them in school by force, Atticus said, but it's silly to force people like the Ewells into a new environment. Another thing, Mr. Bob Ewell, Burris's father, was permitted to hunt and trap out of season. It's against the law, right? Atticus said. But when a man spends his relief checks on green whiskey, his children have a way of crying from hunger pains. I don't know any landowner around here who begrudges those children any game their father can hit. Mr. Ewell shouldn't do that. Well, of course he shouldn't, but he'll never change his ways. Are you going to take out your disapproval on his children? No, sir, I murmured, and made a final stand. But if I keep going on to school, we can't ever read anymore. That's what's really bothering you, isn't it? Yes, sir. Atticus looked down at me. Do you know what a compromise is? A bending the law? No. It works this way. If you'll concede you have to go to school, we'll go on reading every night just as we always have. Is it a bargain? Yes, sir. We'll consider it sealed without the usual formality, Atticus said when he saw me preparing to spit. And, by the way, Scout, you'd better not say anything at school about our agreement. I wouldn't want Miss Caroline after me. Atticus kept us in fits that evening, gravely reading columns of print about a man who sat on a flagpole for no discernible reason, which was reason enough for Jim to spend most of the following Saturday aloft in the treehouse. I spent most of the day climbing up and down, providing him with literature, nourishment, and water, and was carrying him blankets for the night when Atticus said if I paid no attention to him, Jim would come down. Atticus was right.